Welcome to another episode of Distory, and this evening, Kate and I are going to be rediscovering the wonderful project that was supposed to be Epcot. Quite an immense plan that is not just a theme park. So let's delve into that community, the transportation, and industries that created Walt's version of what Epcot was meant to be. And with me, as always, to discover new and research is Kate the Disney Cicerone. What's up, sis?
Hey. Yeah, no, I'm very interested in this episode because there's some new information that has come up that I don't think anybody else has really seen before. So we got some interesting Distory Mail from a listener named Tim, who has a master's in urban planning. So he heard our last episode talking about kind of why Walt wanted to make this original planned community of Epcot. And he sent some really interesting thoughts in and also some resources. He actually sent us an original interview that he did with an Imagineer George McGinnis. So this is not something that the public has ever heard before. And he was like thinking about maybe putting it in a book someday, which I'm like, please, Tim, please do. The world needs these kinds of things. But it was really kind of him to share this interview with us because he did a lot of things with transportation in the original Epcot for Walt Disney. So I'm going to integrate some of those quotes into this episode just so you can hear from George McGinnis and what he had to do with Epcot. But I did have some interesting thoughts from Tim that he shared as someone with a master's in urban planning about this topic. And he said Disney's ideas for Epcot were in line with where urban planning was headed. The concept now is the 15-minute city, meaning everything you need is within 15-minute walk of your house. Transit access, groceries, third places, etc. Victor Gruen, who wrote the book The Heart of Our Cities that Walt carried everywhere, was known as a pioneer of the pedestrian mall. He wanted to get cars out of the urban core. That idea hasn't worked well in many cities because it is implemented in a half-leap manner. Sorry, family show, Tim. But he did say something that I feel like I should have talked about last episode, and I am sorry that I did not, but that is Victor Gruen's book, The Heart of Our Cities.
We honestly were all upset. I was like, dude, why aren't you talking about Victor's book yet? You know?
I know. Like, we all walked away disappointed from that episode. So
it's terrible, dude. We're not good at this.
But it was called The Heart of Our Cities, The Urban Crisis. It was published in 1964. So timeline-wise, this is, 2 years before Walt passed away, right about the time that he was thinking about creating Epcot in his own mind. So he carried this book everywhere, apparently, from everything that I've seen. I just want to mention a few things about Victor Gruen before we kind of dive into Walt's plan, because their plans kind of overlooked. They overlapped each other. In a lot of ways, they fed off of each other in their urban planning mindset. So Victor Gruen was someone who designed the Northfield Mall near Detroit in 1954. It was the first suburban open-air shopping mall, and it was revolutionary to urban design. So he became known as the father of the modern shopping mall, which is ironic that it's kind of dying off these days. But he hated that title because a lot of people did some cheap imitations of his work and it destroyed the communities instead of bringing them together, which was his whole point, was healing communities. That was what he wanted his urban planning to do. So this led Gruen to think about the way that urban centers could be formed. And so if you see the front of this book, it looks so much like these original plans for Epcot in a lot of ways. It's a lot of circular shapes and patterns and radials and whatnot, which we'll explore in this episode. But he believed that there was an underlying cellular nature to properly build community. If the basic unit of life is a cell, and millions of cells can come together to create an organism, he reasoned that an urban structure based on cells or clusters of mixed-use development would be the best system, and it could be scaled up or scaled down as they needed. Interestingly enough, he referenced Disneyland in this book. He said he calls the park an important urban space and an excellent example of cellular urban organization. He calls it a social center, a center of national and international tourism. But he was critical, though, of what happened around Disneyland, with all the chaos and of all the leeches is what Walt called it, right? Of all the businesses moving in. It was a chaotic mess of hotels and restaurants and tourist traps. So he argued that Disneyland was a great start, but more land use regulations would be needed. So you think about this as Walt is reading this book, reading that criticism, and that's when we're starting to see the Florida project take shape, right? He's like, yep, we need more land. We need to have more control over the regulation of that land. So it's so interesting how this was all fed into Walt's vision for Epcot here.
Well, don't you think so? Ready? You have California, land is a massive shortage, right?
Right.
Then they have the Palm Project where they have all of this space. So like, oh man, we could do a lot more. I wonder how much more land we actually could get, because that's kind of when they solidified Florida as their opportunity. And then once they priced it out, they were like, this is dumb to not get an excessive amount so that we can have a massive buffer and then decide what we want to do with it. It'd be another thing if they were purchasing in a massive real estate zone, but they just were not.
Exactly. So interestingly enough, they did eventually, Anaheim kind of got its act together in 2001, though, is when they finally got their act together to make a cohesive vision for that area around Anaheim and kind of clean it up, so to speak. But I do want to mention one final thing about Gruen before we move on and go to Walt's concept, because honestly, we could do multiple episodes on this book and how it influenced Walt Disney's thought patterns about urban design. But he did, Gruen was somebody who put a bid in for the 1964 World's Fair, but not for New York. That was Robert Moses, I think, that ended up getting the design bid for that. But DC was also in the mix as being a potential city for that fair. And he was the one that was hired to create a site plan that would be sustainable after the fair. So it would be then a community of 100,000 people using the fair's infrastructure. And it would have like a huge regional commercial center with shopping, hotels, and offices. And you have to hear this because this is so much like Walt's Epcot plan. So kind of keep this in mind as we go through this episode. But it was supposed to have clusters of buildings on platforms in a park with trucks and other surfaces to be hidden below. The main public areas would be under climate-controlled roof or dome to protect the pedestrians from the brutal weather. It would be surrounding a commercial core, a ring of high-density residential units. So there's rings that happen with this. And beyond the homes would be another ring that would blend neighborhood services with lower density attached residential units. So the entire development would be surrounded by parking and transportation facilities, ringed in turn by an outer area of open land. Basically compared this urban plan to a medieval castle and city, which I think is really fun. What Gruen said was one of the primary purposes for a city is to bring together many people so that through direct communication with each other, they may exchange goods and ideas without undue loss of energy and time. That was kind of his main motivation for behind what he did, which is not exactly the same as Walt Disney, but you can see how those things influenced, Walt Disney from reading this book from that proposal. He probably had access to that because it's so similar to a lot of the things we see.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that look at the imagery of what Victor is proposing in his book on how to modernize cities, and you recognize the fact that Walt Disney stole this. No, but listen, like, why not go to somebody who this is their profession, completely understanding and planning towards the future? I mean, that's what Epcot is supposed to be, is an experimental community of tomorrow. So as a result, why not use the most cutting edge strategies to develop something that has never been built? Because of, like, most cities are built around a geographic need for a port or waterway access. That's like how most of our cities, at least in the United States, were built around. And they just kind of like hodgepodge together based on community structures. And as they got larger, then they would start laying down a lot more of like a framework, which I think is interesting. Can I talk about the cellular thing for just a hot second?
Yeah, go for it.
You talk about cellular structures with Gruen, and I think Tokyo did a really interesting study once. It was an experiment where they were trying to figure out a more efficient way to build their subway system. So they were looking to do some extensions to different tracks and stations. So what they did is they placed food source, like starch food sources, on plates, and they let bacteria grow. And the bacteria could grow in any which way that it wanted to. And but they had obstacles in the way, so it was like almost like a maze in some instances, and that was mainly foundational features that are within Tokyo, the city itself. And as a result, the bacteria were able to find the pathways that were the most efficient to get to the food sources, and it like webbed out, like it was like splintered out if you look at it on a map. And that's exactly what they did to design their subway system revitalization. So they literally took what bacteria used as a more efficient way. So talk about like cellular planning, like that is as close as it gets. Yeah,
I've
it's a
never
really
heard of that
cool.
before.
Yeah, it's a cool experiment that they did, and they integrated it and used it in their subway system. So,
No, that's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that.
yeah. Did you also? I have another fun fact.
Yeah.
You know, Victor, when he was a young kid, he wanted to be a urban planner, right? And his mom got him this really cool like jacket that said like urban planner, but it was like way too big. But eventually, as he got older, Victor grew into it.
I was waiting for it. I was like,
Yeah,
there's
dude,
gonna be
the
something
setup
here.
is. He did. He really did.
It's fantastic. Like I said, we could talk about Victor Gruen for a very long time, but I think we need to move on to Walt's film proposal for Epcot, which we set up in our previous episode. We talked about why he wanted to make this film, the purpose of it and whatnot. So we're not going to go back over all that right now. I feel like we should just kind of dive in from the top of that film and move through it and kind of talk about what he was proposing here. So this film from the jump basically talks about Walt Disney World in general. He's going to introduce what they're going to do with the Florida project. He talks about how Disney World is the perfect location in Florida. It's the very center of the state, easy for tourists to get to and for residents to get to. It's twice the size of the island of Manhattan, which is, as we hear a lot, is 27,400 acres. So they have the blessing of size, which again, now we can pull that back from Victor Gruen's book here as a resource to where he got the idea that they needed more size. Besides the fact that they were really boxed in Anaheim, I don't think it was like a secret that he needed more space. But he did say, this is our first overall thinking about Walt Disney World. Everything in this room may change time and time again as we move ahead. But the basic philosophy of what we're planning for Disney World is going to remain very much as it is now. So he acknowledged that there's going to be changes and whatnot, but he was like, but this is kind of what we got planned. So he wanted enough land to hold all the ideas and plans they could possibly imagine to have. So then he kind of starts listing out some of the plans he's going to have. So one of the things was an airport of the future. So this was going to be an airport that was a short takeoff and land runway, according to George McGinnis, who says this was never fulfilled for Epcot. Obviously, we never got an airport, though, but we did get an airport that happened just outside of Magic Kingdom, just south of the Contemporary, which was the Stollport, which is short for short takeoff and landings. That's what STOL stands for. It was part of a regional network, and it was briefly operated by Shawnee Airlines for just a little while, only about 14 months before they shut it down. And that could be its own episode in itself. But it is really interesting that that did exist for a short period of time because they had the idea that they wanted people to be able to fly in easily and not fight all the traffic in Florida, especially like, you think of I-4 and all that stuff. They didn't want to have people have to fight that. They wanted to be able to get a direct access to Disney World, which is funny because they also had that in Disneyland, right? They had that direct helicopter service from LAX. So the same kind of reasoning there. This strip does still exist, by the way. This landing strip still exists. They just kind of put storage on it now. So the runway still is there, but they haven't used it for years as a runway. So you can see this is where it's at. So you see the Contemporary back there and then the Magic Kingdom.
That road that's in like the foreground to the left over there, that would probably be similar to, or one that would be like one further back would be the one, as soon as you leave the Magic Kingdom, there's like a turnaround and then you make a right before you get to the Magic Kingdom parking gates. And that will take you down this, like, just, it's in the middle of the woods as you're heading to Fort Wilderness on your left. And then eventually you hit Golden Oak. So it's, yeah, interesting.
Anyway, they had the Stollport. It didn't last very long. So there was an airport that did happen at in this Walt Disney World complex, but it was the one that was planned for Epcot never happened, never came to pass. But the other things that he wanted to have, like that, hold all the ideas that we could possibly have. He said there would be an entrance complex where all visitors will enter Disney World, an industrial park covering 1,000 acres, and a theme park. That's just kind of how Walt lines out what Walt Disney World will be about. But then he starts introducing Epcot, and he says, but the heart of everything will be our experimental prototype city of tomorrow, is what he says first. And then he says, we'll call it Epcot, experimental prototype community of tomorrow. So he changes the language about that a little bit during the film. We did mention in the previous episode that Marty Sklar was the one that wrote the script for this, just as an aside as well.
I couldn't live with myself if I couldn't figure out exactly where this was at. So yeah, this was the road that I was talking about, which this goes to Wilderness Lodge. So here's the Magic Kingdom entrance gate. So you could turn off here. It's this Vista Boulevard. So yeah, right when you turn off, technically it would be dead straight ahead is the runway. So it's like, here's your TTC parking lot. Here's right here. If you were to go to like the Polynesian, you would go up straight. Or if you were going to Wilderness Lodge, you'd make a right. But Fort Wilderness, it's the road that takes you to Fort Wilderness. But there, like, you can literally see this is the turn for Fort Wilderness. It's right there.
Right.
That's crazy.
In this picture, you can actually see an X on the runway because this was after they stopped using it as an airport. So they had to put an X on the runway.
Don't use it.
Yes. All right. So Walt, as he's laying out this kind of vision for Epcot, he says this takes its cue from new ideas and new technologies that are emerging from the creative centers of American industry. He says it's a community of tomorrow that will never be completed, but always introducing and testing and demonstrating new materials and new systems, a showcase to the world of ingenuity and imagination of American free enterprise. So he really calls it a new kind of community dedicated to the happiness of the people who live, work, and play here. It's going to be a living showcase that people from around the world can visit, a planned environment demonstrating to the world what American communities can accomplish through proper control of planning and design. That's pretty much word for word as Walt put it, just to give us kind of a framework as we step into explaining exactly what this is about. So it starts with this radial plan. Do you want to talk a little bit about the radial plan? I have a couple of quotes too from McGinnis.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically like the hub and spoke model, right? So you have circular buildings that have offshoots, and within each one has its own like circular design. So you can see each individual complex itself, right? So you have like your entrance visitor center complex with, again, hub and spoke. Each one of these has their own satellite operation. The industrial complex, which is where they were trying to bring in like Monsanto and Ford and all those companies, that has the same kind of system. And then the big community, which is the model that we see on the People Mover. I think people don't really understand that model of Progress City. Like, Progress City is just one little tiny section of this entire project. So, like, if you look at, as an overview, it's like 3 major complexes, not including the Magic Kingdom. You include the Magic Kingdom, now you're talking about 4.
The way that Walt says this is as like spokes of a wheel, the city fans out along a series of radials from a bustling hub at the center of Epcot. And this is the hub that Kirk is looking at here with the city center. The way that George McGinnis put it, that was Walt always thought of Main Street feeding, and then you go out into a spoke, not a far distance. So, you know, of course, Walt, he said mainly Walt called it a weenie, which attracts you, right, which people laugh about. Walt knew people didn't want to know how far they walked. And by attracting them with the People Mover station in the future Tomorrowland, the castle into Fantasyland, and the fort into Frontierland, he always had a lure and icon to lure them into people. So the lure of Epcot was more the center of the city. So that giant building that we saw is really the center of the city. But that hub and spoke model, we see that already in Disneyland from the hub, the Plaza Hub, as you kind of can see all the different parts that you would want to be lured into. You can see the carousel spinning throughout Fantasyland. You could see the Mark Twain floating by in Frontierland. Everything that was like a visual draw to pull you towards things. So there's a network of transportation systems that radiate from the central hub, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, carrying people to and from the heart of the city. This is a huge part of this particular plan. But the primary spheres of activity surrounding the central core, there's business and commerce, there's high-density apartment housing, there's a broad green belt and recreation lands that have playgrounds, churches, schools, and the schools then will welcome new ideas. So everyone who grows up in Epcot will have skills in pace with today's world. That's how they put it. Then outside there, then there is, like you can see here at the bottom, it says residential area. There's a low density neighborhood residential streets as well. So this is essentially single family homes in a radial neighborhood. The plan was to have 20,000 people living in Epcot altogether. But the homes would be built in ways that permit ease of change so that new products may continuously be demonstrated, which I know, Kirk, is something that you probably want to mention.
What?
So for those of you who are listening to our podcast, because some of this will have to be edited out, Kirk is currently battling his cats having a massive cat fight. So
yeah, dude, that's why they call it a cat fight. It's a real thing.
So anyway, I'm just kind of talking about how it's arranged with from the center out. And now we're at the neighborhood residential streets where their plan was to kind of switch out products in their home continuously so that new things could be demonstrated all the time.
Yeah, it sucks. Yeah, so like in the neighborhoods, right? I have a section for this, like about home design and technology integration. Automation in everyday life, or as I call it, this sucks, get out of my house. So in Epcot's neighborhoods, homes will be built with cutting-edge technology inspired by the house of the future in Disneyland. Each house would be self-sufficient, potentially powered by renewable energy sources. Automated systems would regulate the temperature, lighting, and even household waste management using underground tubes to transport garbage to a central disposal area. Technology inspired by Walt's irritation by noisy garbage trucks. And the story is that he would hate getting woken up by garbage trucks when he was like sleeping in his house, and he would like complain about it. Fun fact, they do actually use this system in Walt Disney World, so it's kind of cool that it does get integrated into the Magic Kingdom. So yep, they're sucking all the trash. Yeah. But this was in the houses. And then they also would have public green spaces rather than private lawns, which I think also would bother a lot of people, that would surround each home, reinforcing a sense of community over individual ownership. However, Epcot's residents wouldn't just be spectators to futuristic living. They'd have to be a part of it. The homes, the public buildings, would constantly feature experimental appliances and technology from corporate sponsors, making residents the test subjects for American innovation. This reminds me of Halloween Horror Nights, when Exterminator was introduced in the 50s, and instead of exterminating bugs, it made the bugs giant and huge and eat all the people or turn them into giant bug creature humanoids, cryptids. It was awesome. But no, we shouldn't do that.
That's all you.
Yeah. But no, it's so crazy. Like, I think about all this stuff. Like, I think this is where like Walt is like utopian society and like a little bit of like Big Brother-ish. And he's like, people will live here and people will get these new additions to their homes, whether they like it or not, to the point that they talked about having short-term leases on the housing. Because typically, you purchase a house, you're going to be there for, 30, 40, 50 years, whatever, on your mortgage, like 15 or a 30-year mortgage. They were talking about doing very, very short-term leases because they didn't know if residents would want to be there and always having a constant churn. Or at least that was the discussion with folks in the planning process. And I think Walt honestly was like, they'll like what I tell them to like.
Yeah, well, interestingly, it says everyone who lives here will have a responsibility to help keep this community an exciting living blueprint of the future. So that was kind of how they addressed it, was like, if you're going to choose to live here, you're feeding into this idea of this is going to be this blueprint of the future, and you're going to be okay with having it updated all the time.
Well, that's where it gets weird, because Epcot had like a governance, and so like part of Walt's vision was to control the governance of Epcot and how the citizens worked. There was no like elected officials or mayors or city councils or voting on any of the civic matters. He wanted Epcot's leadership to remain firmly under Disney's jurisdiction and their jurisdiction alone, which his legal team warned them of the potential conflicts of Epcot having permanent residents who would eventually demand voting rights, because at any point you could have your house disrupted if he was like, yo, GE has a new fridge and you're all getting them. And you're like, bro, I have all this stuff in my fridge. And he's like, I don't care. You're trying these.
Like every other week. They're like,
right. Could you imagine? Dude, you're like, all right, how many toasters do I need? So they all do the same thing. Undeterred, Walt suggested rotating residents in and out with no one staying longer than 9 months to maintain corporate control and ensure that Epcot remained a private, self-governed entity. And yeah, I mean, there's so many.
Like, they get squirrely after 9 months, so we're just going to kick them out.
He's like, at 9 months, they go. Like, could you imagine that, dude? Like, I mean, I could imagine let's say you could live in one of the hotels at Disney World, right? pick a hotel, you can live in it. But in 9 months, they're like, we have to refurb the room. I feel like there's probably a decent amount of people that'd be like, okay.
Yeah, the minimalists among us that are like, I'll pack up my 2 suitcases and go some another space.
This might blow your minds. There are people that live in Disney World in the hotels forever.
Yeah.
That's not like, yeah, like I've had cast members be like, yeah, dude, they just change hotels like every couple months when they need a change of scenery. They live in, it's not Golden Oak. It's not a residence, which by the way, Golden Oak isn't even owned necessarily by Disney. It's now third party owned, but it's a little bit fringe on how the governance works there. But yeah, they legit like live in the hotels.
It's like those people that their retirement plan is like cruise ships, like full stop. That's all they do.
Cruise ships, though, make more sense to me because of the medical facilities and the food.
But you have to get off them every week because you're not allowed to stay in your room on cruise ships. You have to disembark and then re-embark on the. So that would be irritating.
Do they have to, though? Like, if these people have been doing it long enough, are they like...
Well, I mean, I don't know. Maybe there's specific ones that let them stay, but I know like Disney wouldn't let you do that. So yeah. Anyway, so these residential neighborhoods, there's also this one this is actually from the 1964 World's Fair. There's Medallion City concept art that shows what the outside of a planned community would look like too, which I thought was kind of interesting.
Join our community. We like having new toasters.
Victor Gruen thought the space-devouring detached single home was not considered as suitable. He was an advocate of clustered attached homes that shared common open space. But Walt Disney disagreed with Gruen on this. So in his Epcot plan, he wanted suburban-style single-family residential units in the outer core. And Buzz Price said it was because Walt wanted a place for his friends to live. And that's why.
Yeah, well, that's
the tea on the real reason why he wanted those.
Guess what? Walt still has elitist things like the Artists Club or Animators Club.
So let's hop over to the urban center. We're kind of on the outer bands. Let's go back to the urban center because this is kind of where a lot of this starts from. So this is the activity of like all the metropolitan city is in the center here for this plan. There's a Cosmopolitan Hotel that's in the middle that also has a convention center. So they said it would be 30 or more stories was the plan for this particular space. And there's some concept art here that is from Herb Ryman, if you recognize the style. He's the one that designed Disney's castles as well. But you can see that hotel in the middle. There's also going to be theaters for drama and music, restaurants, nightlife, and shopping areas. And I found a new term, Kirk, that I've never heard before from Victor Gruen. And that's probably because I'm not an urban planner by trade. But he said that there's areas called like this are called a ped shed. Ped shed, P-E-D-S-H-E-D. A ped shed is the desirable walking distance that a lazy walker or on a one-purpose trip without interruption will walk. So a ped shed is kind of like, this is as far as somebody was willing to walk, is kind of the idea. So if a walker can sit, shop, or eat, it distracts them and they can go longer distances. The length of a ped shed is determined by appearance and atmosphere as well as the climate and topography. So to kind of explain this, they think like, I'm willing to walk down Main Street, USA, because it's a pleasant walk, because there's some AC that's coming out from the shops that makes it comfortable enough for me to walk, because there's things to look at and it's atmospheric. Let's say it's in the hot Florida sun and you're like in the parking lot. That distance of Main Street, USA feels like forever, right? Because there's no shade, there's no atmosphere, there's no AC, there's nothing that's making you want to go forward like the castle. So a ped shed, think of like Main Street, USA is a good example of kind of like a ped shed, is like this atmosphere that allows you to move forward. So interestingly enough, within the ped shed, Gruen suggested slow-moving people carriers like moving sidewalks, but Walt's solution to the ped shed at Disneyland was to use Main Street vehicles for atmosphere. So the Main Street vehicles don't travel very far, and Main Street is not very long, but it is kind of this idea of like getting you farther, that you have an option to hop on a Main Street vehicle if you want. So,
anyway. I mean, it makes a lot of sense in why the Transportation and Ticket Center has a Joffrey's that's still open, because almost all the gift shops and things that they did have at the TTC are closed, minus restrooms. So having restrooms, having access to water, there are vending machines there, and then that Joffrey stand, like that's like fueling you up for the the trudge on the trams and everything else. Same with Animal Kingdom. You have that Joffrey's out there, where I think they should have a Joffrey's at Hollywood Studios outside of it, but they do not. But
they don't need it anymore now that they let you in now. They didn't used to. For a while, they weren't letting you in early. So,
yeah, now they do. It's like we got the ped shed right inside.
So anyway, I love the idea of the ped shed. Here's another some concept art from Herb Ryman as well, showing the bigger picture of this radial design with that hotel in the center. But there's also some streets that recreating the character and adventure of places around the world. So that might sound familiar to you if you think of World Showcase, which we'll talk about in future episodes. But this idea actually comes back to something that has been around in Disneyland almost since the very beginning. So if you look at, this is a very, very early sketch of Disneyland, and you can see Main Street USA there kind of down near the bottom. And if you look to the side of Main Street USA, say you're heading towards the castle at Main Street USA, before you go down the main part of the street, if you go to the right, there's a whole other street there. And this was
What's that street say, Kate?
Yeah, it's International Street. So,
oh my gosh.
And it's on all of this concept art. You can see it here as well, that there's this kind of wonky looking street that you could walk down, which would have had it would have been an international shopping area. And it would have had basically a whole bunch of different countries. And I actually found a model of what this was going to look like, which I hadn't seen before, which was on display, I think, at D23 a couple of years back, which was really neat find for me personally. But you can see it all the way down. It's just kind of like nooks and crannies and all. It reminds me so much of World Showcase in terms of like you can go back into the streets and kind of explore the different.
You kind of get lost a little bit.
Yeah, which is really, really fun. So George McGinnis said he had an international area in downtown, meaning Walt Disney did, and he wanted foreign countries to sponsor. It grew into World Showcase, but the original Epcot plan that I showed in my illustration, which Kirk has there on the bottom, he says, I have Tam O'Shanter, Ireland represented. I have Hong Kong represented, China represented over here, and the guests watching all the movement of the Wedway and the monorail through the painting. So if you look at the one that's kind of on the bottom there for Kirk, here I'll zoom in a little bit for it. You can see the Tam O'Shanter pub there, and you can see the various forms of transportation on the side. So we have to talk about Tam O'Shanter just ever so briefly, because Tam O'Shanter was a very important part of Disney history. It's a restaurant in Los Angeles where Walt Disney and his animators used to sit in the 20s and 30s for lunch before they had their commissary at the Burbank studio. This was close to the Hyperion studio. And this place is still open today, so you can still go and visit it. And then table 31 is where Walt Disney used to sit. There's actually a little plaque on it now. This was a favorite spot of Walt Disney and his, they say Imagineers, but it was mostly animators back then. And they actually have sketches that are on the table as well. And this one looks so much like the dinosaur was in Ford's Magic Skyway, doesn't it? Like the Stegosaurus. So there's also, John Hench gifted them a sketch that's also hanging on the wall. So if you want to go see our original sketch as well. But I just wanted to mention that's why it says Tam O'Shanter in this complex, in this art, because it has this part of Disney history. So anyway,
Walt wanted his bar there. That's the long story short. He just wanted his bar there.
So there's also office buildings in this area.
Most importantly, this entire 50 acres of city streets and buildings will be completely enclosed in this climate-controlled environment. Shoppers and theater goers and people just out for a stroll will enjoy ideal weather conditions, protected day and life from rain, heat, cold, and humidity. And at this time, we can see a skylight right here looking in onto the domed city. So here's a little... So if you've ever heard the term the Disney bubble, this is where it came from, was the enclosed part of the city.
I think it's crazy that still persists as a rumor, even all these years later, that Disney somehow has control over the weather. Like, people still ask about that. It's like, this was from a long time ago now. It was just an idea that it would be climate control, which would be nice, to be honest.
It was just, and it's such a small part, like this space is so massive. And I don't get how, all right, listen, people are really smart. They're really intelligent, but just let's talk about this for a second. How are they doing that? How would they do that? Like, and why can't you see it? Like, this isn't the Truman Show, you know? Like, there isn't a skylight falling down and some dude pulling through the top like, oh, sorry about that. You know?
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe we just haven't found it yet. I don't know. Doesn't feel like real rain.
Yeah. I don't know. It feels like real rain to me a lot of times. It's pretty impressive.
Logic would show, just by how awful the weather is in Florida sometimes, that this doesn't exist. Just saying.
Maybe that's a part of the system to get people out every 9 months. So he's like, I'll make it really bad so that they won't want to stay here.
Yeah, could be. Of course, then I do have just a quick mention of the hotel. I know I kind of breezed by it, but he did call it the shining jewel at the center of the city. And it offered tourists not only the most modern guest rooms and convention facilities, but also a 7-acre recreation deck high above the pedestrian and shopping areas of the city. So that it's basically, that's kind of like a basic layout of how this went down. Before we kind of like jump to transportation, which is a really big part of this plan, I thought we would take a quick break and talk about some things that we are really poor about talking about. We're not good at talking about projects that we currently
It's also making us poor, Kate, by not talking about them.
It is. So, Kirk, what do you have going on over there at Walrus Carp?
New drop. We've got some Doom Buggy glow-in-the-dark ride vehicle croc charms at walruscarp.com. And all of our Christmas holiday merch, our first drop of that, we have 9 new designs out on the website. So yeah, check us out. Walrus, WALRUSCARP.com. That's walruscarp.com.
If anything ever felt like a sponsored message, it was that just now. So,
dude, it is sponsored, bro. Like,
sponsored by
I
us.
pay half this thing.
So for me, I'm still working on my latest book that is coming out soon, which is called Who the Mirror Reflects. Will be out this month. I don't have exact release date yet, but it's coming very soon. So working on that very often right now, trying to get all the edits done for that. So look for that on Amazon, which is also where you can find the rest of my books. If you search Disney Cicerone or Kate Grasso, that's where all of my Disney history books
That's
are.
spelled Grasso. Kate.
Grass with an O.
Grasso.
It means fat in Italian, so that's fun.
Does it really?
It does.
Oh my god. Well, my last name means old, and because it's effeminate, I guess I'm an old woman.
You're old woman, and yeah. I'm fat, and that's where we're at.
So together, we're a fat old woman. Which means that we're very wise. You have to listen to us. We know a lot of things.
The only other thing I have going on right now, and that's not the only other thing, but one of the main things I have going on right now is I did make a really fun 1962 tour of Disneyland that is available on YouTube. So if you ever wanted to time travel back in time and see, go on an official Disney tour with an official script from the Disneyland tour guides from 1962, you can go see that on Disney Cicerone on YouTube. But yeah.
That's spelled Cicerone on YouTube.
Thank you, Kirk, for that.
You're welcome.
Right.
Not everybody knows how to spell that, Kate. We're not all brainiacs.
True. It's like, it comes from Cicero. So anyway. Right. We'll talk about that another day. Let's move on to transportation. In this concept for Walt Disney's Epcot, pedestrian is king. That was their plan. There was not going to be any motorized vehicles in the areas where there was pedestrians, only electric-powered ones. In the residential area, there were footpaths reserved for pedestrians and electric carts and bicycles. And then children would be going to and from schools and playgrounds. They could then be safe from automobiles. That was the idea, is that it would be a safer place for children to be. So I have a photo here of what that residential area looked like, and looks like you do as well.
In this center section would be a people mover, and then you notice these are either walking or biking paths, and then you notice there's lots of like common ground areas, tennis courts, those various like recreation, and then all of the houses you would walk directly into your house here. Now you notice there is a roadway behind the houses, so you can actually own a vehicle and have your own automobile, but there would be no pedestrian access to the automobiles, as the roadway would be outside of the common areas.
So I have a quote from George McGinnis about that. He said, people living there would have their cars in the garage, but not for use to travel downtown to work. They would travel in the Wedway, people mover, and their cars, when they wanted to go to somewhere, there was a ring road to travel to get to the freeway or the highway. When you wanted to go away from your home to another part of Florida, you got in your car, and then there's the ring road that would give you the outlet. So kind of this like ring road outside of the city. So, so really it was a major innovation over especially what Victor Gruen had for his design was transportation, because Victor Gruen, he had some ideas for transportation, but he really didn't have the technology to kind of make it happen in this really efficient way. So this brings us to then the transportation lobby, which George
Well, hang on
McGinnis
real quick. I just want to talk about the roadways real quick.
Oh,
Almost
yeah,
all of them are set up to be one-ways. There was very few two-way directional ones to, one, make things more efficient, and two, to reduce accidents, because that's another reason why automobiles, they want to limit it so that there's less and less occurrences of accidents. But yeah, they were trying. I can only imagine how challenging this would be. Like if you like live on one side of the ring, you're like, I gotta go all the way up. You just picture somebody like, like just going around,
and you're just like, you can't.
I'm assuming that most people probably wouldn't leave the grounds too frequently. You know what I mean? Like you'd probably want to stay.
They're like, we're just going to stay here. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's talk transportation a little bit. And for that, I just want to mention a few things about who George McGinnis is before we kind of move on. So George McGinnis was somebody that they kind of like discovered, Walt Disney discovered while he was in art school. He was doing a project about an underground transportation system. And this is right about the time that Walt Disney was looking to create Epcot. And so he built this kind of underground transportation center with all these really intricate designs. Walt Disney saw it, invited him to WED. And so then George's first job was to design the new modes of transportation for Progress City for this vision of Epcot. So he developed the people movers for Walt's Epcot, and then created some of the artwork that we can see in the film itself that Walt uses. Interestingly, he also went on to do all kinds of other things in the Disney parks. So he did Disneyland's New Tomorrowland. He designed the mighty microscope from Adventures Through Inner Space. He designed the rockets of the Astrojets. He made a whole bunch of vehicles, including the Wedway People Mover in Walt Disney World. So he designed the People Mover that we know and love in Walt Disney World. You can thank George McGinnis for that one.
Thank you, George.
He also was a show designer for the Nautilus subs, the Space Mountain in both coasts. He became the manager of industrial design for Epcot Center in 1979, the version that we know now, and became the show designer for Horizons. So it's actually, I have a picture of him with his family outside of Horizons, which is really fun.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. Later, he also designed the Mark V and Mark VI Disneyland monorails. He did a whole bunch of other projects that he consulted on, including like Indiana Jones vehicles, the Kilimanjaro Safari Jeeps. He was involved in a lot of ride vehicles. So this is just kind of the context of who he is.
That interview with the monorails in particular is crazy. We don't have enough time to like dive into the specifics of monorails.
No.
That would be a whole other can of worms. And we should do that because honestly, when else is that information ever going to be shared?
Right. Yeah. So thank you, Tim, listener Tim, by the way, for
thank you,
sending
Tim.
that to us. We appreciate it. So let's talk about the transportation terminal a little bit, because this is where George McGinnis gets involved and he has some things to say about it. Herb Ryman did the initial concept art. So what you're actually seeing there is Herb Ryman's concept art, except that some of this particular artwork was actually painted over by George McGinnis, which I don't think I ever would have noticed that except for this interview. So if you can see, this was the original concept art. And you can see that the People Mover cars look a little bit different in this one than in that one.
Oh, yeah. Because
right?
He's got the Walt Disney World ones.
Mm-hmm. So he said, I laid out the transportation terminal. Herb Ryman had already made a painting of it, and I was asked to put my bigger People Mover in the painting. So that was an in honor to paint over what Herb Ryman largely considered the finest artist at WDI, and like it's an honor to do that. So he said, in Walt's last film, he used my illustrations of the Epcot with the wedway overhead and the monorail in the distance. He pans to talking about the plan, so I did the illustration that showed how it would look at the guest view, and I was pleased with that. So he was integral into creating that for the film. But do you want to talk about what's going on in this picture a little bit there, Kirk?
Like an onion, we got layers. So there's levels to this transportation hub. So the very, very bottom, we're going to start from the bottom, and now we're here. We're going to get to the top. So all the way on the bottom is Walt's least favorite, which are like truck drivers and industrial. So basically the things that would be supplying the city and the entire Epcot community itself would be in the lowest level highway. And then above this, I know it looks like we're in an earthquake. We are not in an earthquake. This is just a cross section. So we go one level up, and that's going to be all of your passenger automobile vehicles. And then the level that will be most utilized is going to be the public transit. And that's going to be that golden middle layer where folks are commuting or going out for a night on the town. And it's going to be utilizing two different ride systems. One, an elevated monorail, or two, the wedway, aka people mover. Now, I think it's interesting that they would use the open top people mover, because that would only work for this city section that's enclosed. And you can see the bubble domes, like those little skylights here, because you couldn't do that for the ones that actually went out to residential, because they weren't building a dome over each one of those communities.
I think that's why they changed them. I think that's why they updated them to these bigger ones that are covered. Absolutely. And so it said with the monorail in particular, this is the high-speed monorail transit, can take employees either to the theme park or to the 1,000-acre industrial park. And George McGinnis said, the monorail, it was a transportation center of Epcot, and the monorail was the spine all throughout the property. Walt showed the map of Epcot. He shows the attractions, or I'll call them that for lack of better name, along the spine. And I designed a wide body monorail for the spine. It would leave from the airport, where people would come in from Osceola County, below Walt Disney World, and it would travel visiting the industrial park, Epcot, and finally the Magic Kingdom and transportation spine with travel on the monorail. So basically, monorail was long distance, people mover, short travel. And what he had to say about the people mover, he said, you walked from the people mover station with that convenience store to your home. So there was not much walking. The idea was like it would minimize your walking. Walt sketched a people mover station for me because the homes would be circled around it and the workers and the employees rode the people mover out. And then he wanted a convenience store on the lower level. And then the people would buy their milk and eggs and walk 150 feet to their home. And these segments of pie would expand around the transportation terminal. So the idea was kind of like, you didn't have to walk very far from your place of business. You could kind of like stop in the store and then hop on the wedway people mover, and then it would take you right to your home. So it was really like not very much walking involved. It was very efficient in that way. And they did have a couple different versions of the people mover in their concept art as well. Like look at this one. It's like,
oh, that's cool.
It's like circular, octagonal.
Can we talk about something real quick though?
Yeah.
I got my milk. I got my eggs. Why am I stopping every 40 seconds for like a minute and a half on the people mover? Dude, anytime I ride that thing, it is always stopping for load and unload problems. They never, ever could have seen that coming.
Yeah, that's fair.
You know, like, could you imagine? You're like, dude, first of all, the track is massive. Massive. Like, if we look at if they're only stopping at each one of these circles, so think of the people mover in Magic Kingdom because it's the greatest representation of something that actually still exists. So this circular area would be a way where you would load or unload. Same right here. Dude, it would sting to live right here. You'd be like, oh, God, I'm right in the middle of these stupid things. But this is all one track. It's not segmented out into like multiple ones. So as a result, any stoppages would impact the entire line.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing too that I learned about that interview was the amount of speed ramps they were going to use, and how Walt had an affinity for speed ramps over escalators because escalators were dangerous and kids could get caught in them. but
They're
using
Crocs.
speed
They're going to eat
ramps.
your Crocs. He
Right.
saw that coming. He's like,
Well,
nope.
what's weird to me is like the speed ramps that they're talking about are the ones that are on like the ramp from like on the People Mover again in Magic Kingdom, like that style, like a soft style speed ramp. We're not talking about like what Universal has, which is like a metal escalator that just happens to be flat.
No.
So
They use
it's
the
very different.
Goodyear tires underneath it to make it move. And they had that in Disneyland too at the exit of the monorail. Even the early 1960s had it. So this was something they had in their parks a lot. But I think George McGinnis in that interview, he really talks a lot about how they had to design things even in New Tomorrowland and whatnot to kind of accommodate the length of the speed ramp because they took up a lot of space. You know?
Yeah. Well, Jackie mentioned Pirates having a speed ramp as well. And then Space Mountain has a speed ramp. It just is not operating, so it's just a ramp. There's nothing very speedy about it.
They took theirs out at Space Mountain. You're in Walt Disney World. They took it out.
Yeah, it's
gone now.
It's just carpet. Is it just carpet?
Yeah,
I thought we just walk on nothingness. Like
I don't think
it's
so.
like
I think
dead
they
and it doesn't
flat
work.
out took it out because people have been complaining about that for a long time that it's gone. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
Oh,
Research.
I don't go in space that
Mountain.
much. Yeah, I need to.
So not only did people live and work in this area, but there was also going to be something that was an industrial complex that would provide employment for the people of Epcot, but also would work with individual companies to create a showcase of industry at work. So this is going to be like industry on display. And
Industry on display.
They had experimental prototype plants, research and development laboratories, and computer centers for major corporations. So where this kind of came from, where the idea for this was, it was that Walt often visited research labs for companies. That was something he did often because he was interested in the newest technology and how they could integrate it into their parks. So Marty Sklar said whenever Walt Disney came to those places, they would trot out the newest thing they were working on and show it to him. And he would say, when can I buy something with that technology? And they'd say, well, I don't know if the public's interested in that. So Walt thought, why can't I be the middleman between these companies with new things that are coming along and shaping the future? And Marty said that was really the genesis, I think, of the whole idea for Epcot in his mind. That was the genesis of it. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, quite honestly. I think it's more nuanced. But I think that is, something that we have seen in Disney history is like, let's have some new technology and let's put it in front of people so that they can see it. I mean, we even saw that in Carousel of Progress, right? They're starting to put like the new, refrigerators and things in there for people to see on display and then they want to go buy them and whatnot. The idea of kind of introducing the public to new technology and seeing if they want to accept it. We had the bathroom of the future in Disneyland. Remember way back in the day?
Carousel of Progress?
Carousel of Progress. I just said Carousel of
Progress.
Sorry. But yeah, exactly. So this has been something that's been happening in Disney since Disneyland opened in 1955, but this would be on a bigger scale.
Yeah, I like how the narrator in this film, the Florida Project film with Walt, goes, I can just imagine the excitement of the face of teenagers clamoring to see metal car parts being stamped. Dad, look, real flame retardant just was sprayed on that door gasket. Here's where it gets real wonky, though, for me, is that they specifically make a claim that everyone who's in the community has to have a responsibility to keep the community afloat, which means that there is zero unemployment. Everyone is employed in Epcot. So that means
it's true.
Based on your physical abilities, talents, and skills, you have to find a place to be useful in Epcot. You can't just freeload.
Yeah, and that's the challenge. What if you have people in your family who aren't able to work or contribute, or would there be provisions for that? If the elderly,
there are provisions. We have a cab picking you up immediately. Please exit
their
Epcot.
Turn, so it's going to be a while before they come back around.
Thank you for staying at Epcot. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Here's like another big issue that Walt kind of ignored, is that he thought that all of these companies would be okay, much like showing people the inside of an animator studio versus showing people trade secrets of their patent pending industrial products and services that they're developing. So I think there was a little bit of, again, that utopian mindset of Walt's thinking that companies would be super, super stoked to be like, dude, we've just created a brand new cereal varnish, and we want everybody to see. Don't use any of that technical jargon. So Walt's plans for Epcot mirrored the controversial company towns of the past, such as Pullman, Illinois, and Ford's ill-fated Fortlandia. In these cases, corporations controlled everything from housing and employment and often led to tensions, unrest, and eventually the downfall of these towns. So some of these major concerns of like how industries would also control the companies were another big issue, because we have communities that existed where industry was injected into them and created the communities around it. I mean, even to today, there are so many locations like a Flint, Michigan, where once industry leaves too, there's nothing. So like, what happens if there's a gap in like ownership or property? You know, like Amazon is Amazon does this all the time. They'll get some sort of tax break in a town to build a warehouse and employ people. And it might be like a 10-year lease, and then they'll just abandon everything. They'll abandon all the warehouses, and they'll just rebuild somewhere else because of the breaks. So, like, I think there was the concerns of that as well, that people would you would incentivize companies to come, but why would they eventually stay once those incentives ran out?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's always, those utopian cities are always good in theory, you know, but in practice, like, you know, we're already running into things like people don't want their fridge updated all the time. What about the people mover having to stop all the time? So it's actually not very efficient way to move around, like all those things that you don't foresee before you actually dive into the project. And then it makes it a challenge to actually make it successful.
You know what they need? I'm going to pull a little old school here. They need, just like the Odyssey, you need something like lotuses for the people to eat so that they don't want to leave the island, you know? So like the lotus right? Wasn't it the lotus eaters? I'm trying to like look it up real quick.
No.
Do you know what I'm talking about? In
No,
Greek mythology?
Yeah,
lotus eaters were a race of people living on an island dominated by a lotus tree. A plant with botanical identity is uncertain, but the lotus fruit were primary food, and it was a narcotic, causing the inhabitants to sleep peacefully, and they would become addicted to it. So, like in Homer's epic poem, The Odyssey, Odysseus lands on the land of the lotus eaters and like loses half his crew because they start eating the lotus leaves and they don't want to leave.
I haven't read that since high school, so.
Oh, it's so good, dude. You got to brush up on it. Yeah.
Yeah, I am. I need to brush up on my Homer. It's true.
But that's what they need. They need some sort of, well, I mean, I guess the parks are kind of like our lotus eating, you know what I mean? Like, I'm still drawn to them. Like, I haven't left. They could price hike me for forever, and I still, like, as my pass increases, so do the single day tickets. So it's like, okay, it's still only 7 days, and my pass is paid. Like, it's like,
right,
you got
right,
me. I'm here.
Right.
I'm stuck. I am the lotus eater. I'm having a very self-reflectory moment right now. Okay.
Well, it's interesting that you kind of bring that up, because the theme park Magic Kingdom was going to be kind of tangential to what Walt actually wanted. Like, it was the draw that would pull people in and then like lure them in with the theme park and then give them Epcot. That was kind of like the plan for Walt Disney World as a whole. Like Magic Kingdom, we always think of like Magic Kingdom as kind of like the center and the heart, but it wasn't. It was like Epcot was supposed to be the heart of Walt Disney World. That was the plan. That was Walt's plan, was Epcot was at the very heart, and everything else was just kind of like, well, they already know Disneyland, and so they'll want to come to Magic Kingdom because it's like Disneyland and it's in the East and whatnot. But it's really funny to me that, like, I ran into that quote today. Did you ever hear this one, Kirk, where he says, you can't top pigs with pigs? I feel like we talked about this in a
Wait, you can't top pigs with pigs?
Yeah. So
no.
This is a quote from Walt Disney that he said it when, after he did the Three Little Pigs in animation, the short Three Little Pigs. And people are like, well, what are you going to do next? Like a sequel? Like, what are you doing next? He's like, well, you can't top pigs with pigs. So we got to do something new, was the ascension. That was the philosophy that kind of got embedded into Disney culture from that point, which is why Mark Davis was so mad about having to repeat Pirates. Cause he's like, you can't top pigs with pigs. Like we've already done this. Right. So I think for, Walt, in his mind, he was like, well, we can't just repeat ourselves with Disneyland, with Magic Kingdom. Like, we have to like do something bigger, better. This will be the something that they know, but I want to do something bigger.
But time out. In both Pirates and in Big Thunder, so Big Thunder being what should have been River Expedition, and Pirates being a sequel, or basically a shortened down version of Pirates Disneyland, both have pigs.
They do.
And they topped pigs with pigs.
They topped pigs with
Although
pigs.
technically the pigs, I feel like the pigs that are on Big Thunder are not as good pigs as Pirates. So I guess you can't top pigs with pigs. Yeah. All right. I have to talk about one thing that would be an annoyance. I don't know why. I'm like just griping on this city. This whole concept is like
you were
ludicrous.
really like bitter.
I am. I don't want to live here, dude. This is terrible. Could you imagine, right? Could you imagine the commute for people who are just visiting? The visitor center's here. You have to go through the industrial complex. Then you have to go through Progress City. And then you actually get to the Magic Kingdom. So, like, we complain about having to go from the TTC to the Magic Kingdom, which also does stink. But could you imagine having this park here and then go through? I'm like, enough. I don't need to see what Ford is doing with tires. Like, let's go, man. Oh, now I got to go past all people's houses. Like, this is where people
I don't
live.
think Ford would have been there. They didn't get along, him and the Ford company, after that Ford Magic Skyway thing.
Okay.
So.
Well, what do you pick a company? Monsanto? Great. I got to watch them throw like a bunch of pesticides and everything. Awesome. Let's see it. Genetically modify our food. All right. I'm stopped. I'm done.
Do that with Living with the Land. Don't we already do?
But they use like ladybugs and stuff.
They do.
You know?
They do.
Use little lady gentleman bugs.
That's true. Gentleman bugs. Anyway, so they wanted to draw people in with the park for Epcot. They draw people with the Magic Kingdom. But of course, everything changed when Walt passed away, which we won't get into this episode. That's going to be the next one. But would Epcot have worked, I think, is the question. Would this version have worked? We've already kind of touched on some of it. I have a couple of thoughts, Kirk.
No. All right. What are your thoughts?
From our listener, Tim, who sent in that wonderful McGinnis interview, he said he thinks Disney's plan had merits, but I think his devotion to big technology companies as the main drivers of progress would make Epcot unbearable. The idea that Epcot would be a constant city on the move, implementing continuous innovation, would scare a lot of people off. People want consistency. The cookie-cutter quality of the radial neighborhoods would also be a problem for most Americans, I think. And I agree with that. I think people would have a hard time with, they can't paint their house a certain color, or they have to like look exactly like their neighbor, or like, we like to be individualistic.
I think the other challenge as well is that this is like a forced community. Now, not everyone has to live there, but because of the scope of it, it's not like a cult, right? Like a cult compound where you only need 120 people, you know? Like, this is a massive city complex that requires, even though your entire demographic would be wildly diverse, both in education, skill sets, everything, you're attempting to try to have all of them fit into a mold. And I think people like their own personal freedoms and space. Could you imagine if, like, you just want to go home and you don't want to, like, sit with people? Like, you just want... Do you know what I mean? Like, right. There's no use of all this. And granted, I'm also taking this from a 2024 mindset where we use cars all the time. Like, maybe I'll feel different when things are more autonomous. Like, we're going to have autonomous vehicles everywhere in the next decade. So, like, I have to wrap my head around that, and, like, what does that world look like? I'm not sure. But I can tell you right now, back in the 70s, people were not ready for this. The independence of motor vehicles might have been daunting and a nuisance for Walt, but people loved it and relished it. And why do you think people road tripped? Yeah, people road trip down to Florida all the time. Yeah, Americans love their cars.
Well, and you also have to think about the idea of this being you're almost like living in a fishbowl in a way. Like, not that they're necessarily looking into your particular house. You're living in a bubble, but you're living in, like, people, you're supposed to be there on display so people can, like, see how you're living, right? So it's like we're supposed to come to Epcot and how to be inspired and see all the new stuff. And, like, I don't know if I want to be on display all the time. Like, no, thank you.
Golden Oak has a gate with security for a reason.
Because people would be there all the time. Look at that cute house and like taking pictures of your home all the time, right?
Yeah, you'd be like, get out. I paid a lot of money for this.
So I do have some thoughts from Buzz Price about whether or not it would have worked. He was somebody who was, very integral in the design of the Florida project of Walt Disney World. And he was very involved with Walt Disney. And he said, absolutely, yes. Walt would obsess over a problem. He said Epcot was not revolutionary, but evolutionary. Walt was going to use tried and true architectural technologies, creatively blend the land uses, and arrange them in a way where the hotel and day guests are coming from one direction and they would meet the residents coming from another direction. So everyone would interact in a beautiful, comfortable, and inspiring public setting. So he said Epcot would have been more famous than Walt Disney World.
Sounds like that Jonestown devotee was drinking the Kool-Aid. Just saying.
Yeah. So all that being said, there was people that believed it would work and people that believed it wouldn't. And I think that they definitely had some challenges that they would have had to overcome to actually make it work.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing out of all of this that you should take away is that Epcot is not a theme park. Epcot was supposed to be a industrial, transportation, and giant city of the future. So with residential communities throughout, everything, hospitals, like you got to look at a city. That is what it was supposed to be. And it wasn't just supposed to be one little small section. It was 4 sections all combined together through various modes of public transit. It's so wild. I can't look at Epcot and be happy anymore. I just can't. I can't. I mean, for a long time, I always felt like it was disjointed. And ever doing this research, I just am like, this is not what this is supposed to be. But there are, like, I still like the beginning and I still like the end, but I like them separate. Is that weird? We'll get into that, but I think it'll make more sense next week.
Yeah, I think that's where we're headed next is we're going to talk a little bit about the Progress City model that they created after Walt passed away and go into, how in the world did Epcot end up like what we have now from what we just saw? Because
somebody in the comments just said, now we drink at 10 a.m. at Epcot. I couldn't help but. How do you not laugh at that? It's like, man, we have this experimental prototype community of tomorrow, but make sure in England to not have trash can flaps. If you know, you know.
I mean, it's its own experimental kind of community. It's the kind where you can walk around an entire world while drinking. I don't know. I got nothing.
Epcot. Eating while pretending other countries are teaching you something.
What kind of acronym is that?
I don't know. I had to add a lot of articles in there to make it make sense.
Well, so anyway, next time on Distory, we're going to dive into how in the world Epcot went from this version to what we have now. That's where we're going to be going next. We are going to be taking a week off just because I'm going to be traveling to Epcot and traveling to Walt Disney World, and I have a lot of things going on. But we will be back the next week, and we'll cover what happened to Epcot, I guess is where we're going next. So as we wrap up here, Kirk, do you have any final thoughts about Epcot?
It's not your way, it's Wedway.